Today's story is one of those grim little corners of American and specifically Colorado history that refuses to stay buried no matter how much time passes. It's a story of snow, hunger, suspicion, greed, and one man whose name became permanently welded to one of the most disturbing mysteries of the American West. On April 23rd, 1907, Alferd Packer died in Colorado. By then, he was an old man, worn down, no longer wandering mountain trails or prospecting for gold. He had served time in prison, he had been paroled, and he spent his final years living more quietly than you might suspect for a man whose name had become shorthand for cannibalism. Some people knew him late in life and described him as being a generous man. Some said children liked him. Some even tried to paint him as a rough soul crushed by bad luck and public hysteria. But the problem was always this: 5 men had entered the Colorado mountains with him in the winter of 1874, and only Packer came back out. And when he came back, he did not just bring his own hunger, fear, and survival story with him. He had a full belly, and he brought their money and their possessions and their weapons and a string of explanations that changed so often they became their own kind of confession. So today we're not just talking about Alferd Packer and his death. We're talking about what he took with him when he died. To understand why his death mattered, we have to go back to the very beginning of his life. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1842 and later grew up in Indiana. By all accounts, he did not enjoy a peaceful or especially promising early life. He had a rough relationship with his family, and as he got older, he drifted. During the American Civil War, he briefly served in the Union Army, but epilepsy and seizures led to his discharge. He re-enlisted, and again, his health forced him out. After that, he headed west, which in those days was a place where reinvention came easily and truth often did not. A man could arrive with almost nothing and claim to be a scout, a guide, a miner, a ranch hand, a rich man, or a seasoned frontierman. Sometimes he really was. Sometimes he was mostly selling confidence, wearing a blue hat. Packer drifted through jobs and places for years. He worked as a hunter, a teamster, a ranch hand, and even as a miner. He had a reputation for not holding on to work for very long. He quarreled. He exaggerated. He was known as a liar and a suspected thief. Even people who only knew him casually tended to come away with the same kind of impression of him. He was difficult. He was slippery. He was the kind of man who could tell a short story, but could not keep it standing upright for very long. Still, in the West, even questionable men could find opportunity if they attached themselves to the right expedition, and that is exactly what Alferd Packer did. In late 1873, a group of prospectors set out from Utah, lured by reports of gold in Colorado's San Juan Mountains. Like many such groups, they were made up largely of men who didn't know one another very well. They were united less by friendship than by hope, which can be dangerous enough when winter is coming. Alferd Packer joined the party near Provo, Utah. For those who don't know, that is near Salt Lake City. He claimed he knew the territory very well. He claimed he was the guide. He claimed he could help them to get through. That was convenient because the men needed one, and in frontier country, a confident liar can look very similar to a useful expert for the first few days. But almost immediately, trouble began to show. Members of the expedition later said that Packer clearly did not know the country the way he claimed to. He was greedy with food. He was lazy, argumentative. He was fixated on how much money the others had brought with them. That last detail matters, and I'm going to circle back to it. His supposed experience as a guide seemed thin. His equipment was poor. He carried a revolver instead of a proper rifle. He had seizures, of course, from the epilepsy. He quarreled, especially when one member of the group, Frank Miller. And nothing about him inspired confidence except the confidence he projected himself. But yet they kept moving. Winter was already bearing down hard on them. Snow covered the trails and provisions shrank. Wagons and animals struggled. The party became lost. At one point, they were reduced to surviving on horse feed and stood on the edge of eating their own horses. This was not a dramatic and fun adventure anymore. It was becoming the sort of desperate, stupid, freezing mistake that frontier history is full of. Then came a moment that should have saved their lives. The date was January 21st of 1874. The party had reached the camp of Chief Ore near Montrose in the Uncompahgre Valley. Ore is known for helping white travelers at the time, and he did that. He gave the men food and shelter, but more importantly, he gave them really good advice. Do not cross the mountains in winter. Wait until spring, he told them. He reportedly told them that no Ute would attempt such a journey under those conditions. That alone should have settled the matter. If the people who knew the land best weren't going to do it, then men already weakened, underfed, and undersupplied certainly should not. But this was where pride, impatience, and bad judgment entered the story like little accomplices. Some of the men decided to push on anyway. Packer was among them. More than that, he favored taking a mountain route that was supposedly shorter, despite the fact that they had minimal food, poor clothing, very few matches, no snowshoes, and no business pretending this was a manageable risk that they could take. 6 men finally broke off together, Packer and 5 others. George Noon was a teenager. Israel Swan was an older man rumored to be carrying a great deal of money on his person. James Humphrey, Frank Miller, Shannon Bell, this made up the party. On February 9th, they left for Los Pinos Indian Agency, but they never arrived together. Then after 65 days, Packer emerged alone. Picture that scene in your mind. Men at the agency are eating breakfast. Into this ordinary moment stumbles a man who's been gone for weeks in brutal mountain winter. He begs for food and shelter. He carries a knife, a rifle, a steel coffee pot, and a satchel. He says he has survived starvation, isolation, and abandonment. But something seems off pretty much immediately. He does not look like a man who has been chewed down to the bone by hunger. Witnesses later said that he looked bloated rather than skeletal. He could not digest food properly at first, but his body did not fit the image of a man living on roots and rosebuds for 2 months. He said the others had abandoned him and he had survived alone. And then he went into town, and this is where the case begins to curdle like bad milk. Once in Sacagawea, Packer started spending money. A lot of it. He bought a horse. He paid for lodging. He bought supplies. He reportedly flashed multiple wallets. He offered to lend money to people. This was a man who had joined the expedition with almost nothing, and yet here he was, suddenly liquid in a frontier saloon after 5 of his companions had vanished. That alone would have been enough to raise suspicion, but the people who knew the missing men began arriving in town. Preston Nutter, one of the original members who had stayed behind in safer circumstances, saw him and confronted him. Nutter noticed the rifle Packer carried had belonged to one of the dead men. He noticed that Packer's knife had belonged to Frank Miller. He listened to Packer's explanation and found it absurd. And really, who wouldn't? Why would 5 men unfamiliar with the country abandon their supposed guide in a blizzard while handing him a valuable rifle and then vanishing into the snow? Why did Packer look comparatively well nourished? Why did he have their belongings? Why did he have so much money? Soon enough, the authorities brought him back for questioning, and under pressure, the first official crack appeared. Packer admitted to cannibalism. Now, that's the detail that made him famous, but even then, it was not automatically the thing that condemned him the most. Americans already knew the Donner Party story. People could imagine what starvation might force human beings to do. Cannibalism was horrifying, yes, but not in itself the central legal issue. The real question was, did these men die in the wilderness and get eaten afterward out of necessity? Or did Alferd Packer murder them? That question has never stopped echoing. Packer's stories changed again and again and again. In one version, the others killed Israel Swan first and then Frank Miller, then Humphrey and Noon, each one becoming food as conditions worsened. Finally, Shannon Bell supposedly attacked Packer, forcing him to kill Bell in self-defense. In another version of a story, Bell murdered the rest, and Packer only killed Bell after discovering his slaughter. In yet another story, some men died naturally, some were killed, and Packer was simply trying to survive inside a nightmare not of his own making. Every version had the same convenient feature. Packer always ended up being the least guilty man in the story. But then the bodies were found, and that changed everything. Months later, searchers located the remains near what came to be called Dead Man's Gulch. It's still called that to this day. The bodies were not scattered over a journey that fit Packer's tales. They were together. The scene suggested camp, killing, butchering, and a horrifying degree of violence. Some skulls showed blunt force trauma. Flesh had been cut from the bodies in substantial amounts. Bell's body appeared to have been the last to die, but the arrangement and the damage did not really support Packer's shifting narratives. Most damaging of all, evidence suggested that the men may have been attacked before supplies had fully run out. There were still possessions and signs of camp life present. Some investigators came away convinced that Packer had not simply survived starvation. They believed that he had led the men into catastrophe, then killed them and used their bodies to survive while snowbound. And that theory has remained powerful for a reason. It explains the money, it explains the possessions, it explains the lies, and it explains why he emerged alive and not looking nearly as wasted as one might expect. Packer was arrested, escaped, disappeared for years, then was caught again in Wyoming in 1883, living under an alias. He confessed again, revised again, defended himself again. At his first trial, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. But that sentence was overturned on legal technicalities. See, it happened even back then. At a second trial, he was convicted of manslaughter on 5 counts and sentenced to 40 years, an astonishing sentence for that time. He served 18 years before being paroled in 1901. And then something strange happened that so often happens in American history when enough time passes. That villain softened around the edges. A journalist named Polly Pry campaigned for him, recasting him less as a butcher and more as a tragic frontier survivor. He worked as a guard for the Denver Post. He lived more quietly. Stories of his old age described a man who had mellowed, who was charitable, who was liked by children. He reportedly respected Pry deeply and called her his liberator. That made for a strange emotional aftertaste, doesn't it? Here a man can age into gentleness and still have done such monstrous things. Time does not solve that mystery. It only complicates our appetite for simple endings. When Packer died on April 23rd of 1907, the official cause was described in vague terms involving worry and mental decline. He was 65. He never received a full pardon. He never gave a final version that settled any of these matters. He died with the central truth still locked away somewhere between memory, self-preservation, and whatever conscience he might have had left. And then, because the story is apparently determined never to behave normally, it kept getting stranger even after his death. His grave became notorious. His marker was stolen. It had to be replaced. In later years, rumors spread that his skull had been removed, dissected, preserved, and eventually passed into sideshows and museum hands. Ripley's claimed to possess it. Whether that skull is truly his remains disputed even now, which feels somehow appropriate. Even his bones seem reluctant to sit still in one version of the truth. Then in 1989, the victims were exhumed and studied again. Forensics examinations suggested blunt force trauma, hacking, defensive wounds in some of their arms, and evidence broadly consistent with a violent attack rather than simple death from exposure followed by reluctant survival cannibalism. One later investigation found evidence that Bell had indeed been shot, which may support at least one piece of Packer's story. But even that doesn't save him, it only deepens the murk. Perhaps Bell did attack him. Perhaps Bell killed the others first. Perhaps Packer killed Bell after Bell had become dangerous. Or perhaps Packer shot Bell during a crime Packer himself had already set into motion. This is the maddening thing about this case. Even when a fact seems to click into place, it does not resolve the whole machine. It just gives the mystery one more moving part. And that is why Alferd Packer still matters. Not because he was the only cannibal in frontier history. Not because his case was the most legally neat. But because it sits right on the line between a survival story and a murder story. And maybe crossed that line so many times that no one can point exactly where it happened. He was almost certainly a liar. And he was almost certainly a thief. And he was almost certainly responsible in some criminal way for the deaths of those men. But was he as desperate a man trapped inside a horror of winter and bad choices, who then lied because the truth was too ugly to be able to survive socially? Or was he, as many believed then and now, a predator who attacked and attached himself to vulnerable men, led them into lethal isolation, robbed them, murdered them, feasted on their bodies, all while waiting for spring to let him just walk out? He took the answer with him. And perhaps that's why the story still unsettles many people more than a century later. Not because the mountains killed men. The West is full of that. Colorado is full of that. And not because hunger led to cannibalism. History has seen plenty of that too, all the way back to the Neanderthals. But because the center of this case is a human being who had every reason to lie and just enough truth in his lies to keep them alive. So when Alferd Packer died in 1907, the body that went into the ground was only part of what got buried. The rest was motive and sequence. The rest was whether the first blow fell in panic, opportunity, or premeditation. The rest was whether 5 men died because winter was merciless or because the wrong man convinced them to trust him. That is the secret that he carried away that day. But now I want to hear what you think. After everything that you've heard on his story, what do you believe Alferd Packer took to his grave? Was it the shame of a desperate survivor? The guilt of a calculated murderer? Or the confidence that he had muddied the truth just long enough that no one could ever pin the darkest part on him for good? Tell me in the comments. I really do want to hear where you land on this one. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.